New from Post L, 20 dynamic post office raids, including the sensational Saddleworth climb, the Heald Green getaway, the diabolical Disley disaster, featuring the sensational Gordon Yates and the Postettes singing I'm Not Green, You Know. Yes, all this and more available from Post L on an 8-track.
It's said that familiarity breeds contempt, and after 3 months of uneventful transmissions, a more relaxed atmosphere was evident on Radio Aquarius. This sense of security, though, was shattered shortly before Christmas of 1973, when the team were making plans for a 2-day special, which would cover Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. The plans involved a conveyor belt of freshly charged car batteries, the old ones being taken away for recharging, and a shift operation of presenters constantly recording programmes onto cassette. Everyone was looking forward to this exciting event, but the post office and Gordon had other plans. 1 week before the planned venture, Aquarius was raided. Charlie was on site along with Dave, Pete W and Pete F. Bob was there too, but had temporarily wandered away from the wood. Charlie then asked Andy to knock up a transmitter with a view of coming back on the following Sunday. The plans for a 2-day Christmas special, however, were dropped in favour of a standard Sunday afternoon transmission. Obviously, a move away from Parswood was called for, and for the next couple of months, various sites in the South Manchester area were used as broadcast locations. Charlie had been busy constructing a new VHF transmitter, and in the early spring of 1974 it was put to work on a new nighttime Aquarius, broadcasting from a site at the top of the slag heaps in Hazel Grove in Cheshire. The output stage hadn't yet been completed, so the first few transmissions from here were only 300 milliwatts, but reception was good over a wide area. Separate tapes were made by DJs for this service, which had a more progressive, album-based sound. In an attempt to quickly raise the power of the transmitter, Charlie persuaded a friend to build a transistorised 5-watt amplifier that vastly increased the coverage of Aquarius's nighttime FM service and also led to the swelling of the postbag. Compositions, requests and dedications kept the mail coming in, and news of Aquarius's exploits regularly appeared in the newspapers, but on the horizon loomed ILR, or Independent Local Radio. London already had 2 of these stations, LBC and Capital Radio. Birmingham's BRMB was next, and Manchester was to get Piccadilly Radio on April the 2nd. Piccadilly had been testing for a few weeks when Charlie came up with the idea of competing with them for their first day's audience. All that was required was some careful organisation and preparation. This took the form of pre-recording about 10 hours worth of programmes and making sure there'd be enough car batteries to last the day. A location which would provide good coverage of Manchester was a must, and of course Aquarius should be on air before Piccadilly's 5 AM start. Aquarius's first hour would be continuous music with no identification, and Charlie thought that people would think they were tuned to Piccadilly. To get on the air before 4 AM, a very early start would be called for. A better idea was to take the equipment up to the location the previous evening and have a couple of staff stay overnight, ready to switch on the following morning. An extra car battery was procured from somewhere, and at 10 o'clock on the Monday night, the team consisting of Charlie, Barry, Andy and Frank plus 1 or 2 others found themselves stumbling by moonlight over rough moorland on their way to Lyme Park, which is located off the A6 at Disley in Cheshire. At one end of the park is a large hill covered with trees, and the area Charlie had chosen was called Lantern Wood. Across the top of the hill ran a dry stone wall, and it was behind this that they gratefully dropped their pile of gear. Charlie told Andy how to finally tweak the frequency of the transmitter to bring it as close to Piccadilly as possible, and the necessary adjustment was made shortly before the start of the transmission. Barry and Andy then settled down for the night while the others made their way home to their warm beds. As they listened to the radio and chatted, it became clear that the weather, which up to now had been mild and still, was worsening rapidly. A gusting wind sprang up, and the clouds descended on the top of the hill in an almost freezing mist. After a long night, the sky showed the first signs of dawn. It was 3:30 and time to get going. Barry and Nick began assembling the 3-element aerial, while Andy applied 12 volts to the exciter and trimmed it onto frequency. Meanwhile, across Manchester, Roger Day was preparing his first show for Piccadilly Radio, and a very nervous newsreader practised his delivery. Everything was ready to go by 10 to 4, so they decided to radiate 10 minutes of dead air before starting the first tape. The high voltage generator, wind up to full speed, provided the output valve with 350 volts, and Aquarius was on the air. The pile of cassette tapes kept the tape player happy, but at about 10 o'clock it began to slow down due to the batteries nearing empty. New cells were quickly fitted, but how long would they last? Luckily, Charlie arrived soon afterwards, bringing with him a lantern battery. Charlie explained that he'd been listening to the broadcasts since about 7 o'clock and he'd made his way via Stockport to central Manchester, listening all the way. He'd heard the first set of cassette batteries give up and decided to bring along a spare power source just in case. Eventually all the tapes had been played and a second car battery, which had been powering the transmitter since 11 o'clock, was starting to sag, so it was time to call it a day. The results from Disley were so good that they returned to the same spot several times over the next few weeks. It wasn't an easy location to reach, with about half a mile of moorland in one direction and the park and grounds of Lime Hall in the other. So, with enough lookouts and a bit of forethought, it should have been possible to foil any attempted raid by Gordon and his merry men. However, a false sense of security was again the team's undoing. It was over 4 months since the raid at Parrs Wood, and they'd all begun to relax. On Sunday the 5th of May, Aquarius was set up as usual, with the aerial stuck in a handy tree and the transmitter and car battery on the ground below. The broadcast started at 11 AM. Conditions were cool and bright, with good visibility over the stone wall nearby, and every now and then someone would grab the binoculars and peer down across the moor, checking for suspicious activity. It was new recruit Trevor James who raised the alarm. He was looking over the wall when he spotted something and reached for the binoculars. After a few moments he said he could see men in suits at the far side of the moor, and as nobody in their right mind would be dressed like that to come for a stroll in those conditions, it had to spell trouble. One by one they looked through the binoculars and all agreed that it was probably a raid, but even if the men in suits ran all the way up to the site, it would take them several minutes to cross the rough ground, so there should have been plenty of time for them to go off the air, hide the stuff and run away. Trevor climbed up the tree and pulled down the aerial, while the rest of them began to dismantle the transmitting equipment and hide the bits and pieces inside bushes and amongst the bracken. Now it was time to get away from the scene of the crime, and Trevor took the cheeky option, climbing over the wall and heading straight for Gordon's men, armed with binoculars. The others, Charlie, Bob, Andy and Pete, went straight down the slope towards the park itself. Charlie was in front, and at the bottom of the hill he heard a voice shout his name. The voice belonged to Gordon the pirate hunter himself, who was leading a second gaggle of GPO men in from the other direction. Charlie, realising he'd been recognised, began to run and became separated from the group, who found themselves at the foot of a high stone wall. In view of the approaching Gordon, it seemed wise to put something in his way, so they all scrambled over the wall and onto a deserted pathway. Bob began tearing up an Aquarius business card that he'd found in his pocket, sprinkling fragments as he walked. Then, the next minute, around the bend came another group of suits, one with a camera merrily clicking away. Bob, Pete and Andy were escorted to Lime Hall, where one by one they were invited to sit out in the garden and answer a few of Gordon's questions. The case appeared at Ashton-under-Lyne Magistrates Court on December the 10th, 1974. Charlie, Bob, Pete W and Andy were all there, and they were charged with illegal broadcasting. Also present was Frank, a new member of the team, Tim. Neither had anything to do with the Disley disaster, but between then and this court appearance they'd been nabbed for other broadcasts, including the much reported Heald Green getaway. Chris Welton, defending, tried to get the case dismissed on the grounds that although there had indeed been some kind of illegal transmission from Lyme Park on the Sunday in question, there was no real evidence that linked the men in the dock to that activity. After this approach didn't work, he called into question the accuracy of the post office's direction finding apparatus, with similar results. To support their case, the post office produced a carefully sellotape reconstruction of Bob's card, complete with a contact phone number written on the back. In the end, they were presented as enthusiastic but misguided radio hams who were in no way politically motivated. Either way, the fines were in the main quite reasonable, from Tim's £50 to Bob's £150. The following Saturday, Charlie, Frank and Andy toured the Manchester area looking for a site for Sunday's broadcast. The post office hadn't discovered the transmitter hidden in the bracken at Disley, so Aquarius was able to appear on the air the following week as if nothing had happened. Alderley Edge was chosen because of its clear view over Cheshire and South Lancashire, so the next day a rain-sodden and rather quiet team consisting of Charlie, Bob, Pete and Andy hauled the new aerial up into treetops and put programmes on the air. This turned out to be a complete waste of time. Perhaps it was the wet trees in the vicinity of the aerial, or perhaps there was something wrong with the transmitter, but whatever it was, it stopped the signal almost dead. The coverage over South Manchester was very poor and Aquarius was almost inaudible, so they needed a new site for next Sunday's transmission. The usual South Manchester sites were abandoned the following week in favour of Althing Pike, overlooking Greenfield in Saddleworth, about 10 miles northeast of the city. This was a difficult climb for Bob, Trevor and Pete. Just across the way on another hill was Piccadilly's FM mast, so surely this must be a good site. Indeed it was, but only in a certain direction. Manchester itself got a good strong signal, but to the south the signal was weak and patchy, screening by local hills being to blame. Either way, an unpleasant surprise lay in wait. Near the end of the transmission, when the last tape was playing, a group of cross-country runners came gasping by. Bob had seen them coming a mile off, but then a shout of "now" rang out and all hell broke loose. GPO operatives, policemen and dogs appeared out of nowhere, having completely surrounded the hilltop. The transmitter was lost along with the cassette player and the aerial, and in a small-minded display of victory, the post office men smashed up the car batteries to prevent the Aquarius team from retrieving them for future use. What started as a fairly successful broadcast had ended with the loss of a complete set of equipment and more summonses in the pipeline. If you want to follow the story from here, then the next chapter will be up tomorrow night, where some lessons are learnt for Radio Aquarius.
Tony agrees.
Oh, it's lovely, Aquarius is.
Tony agrees.
Radio Aquarius, the music of yesterday.
Oldie.